and what was the third one? Death. Oh, yes, very important. Go ahead, Robert.
We'll forget about that one right now.
Yeah. So, you know, when Alex was talking, it reminded me, and I don't remember who said this, but there's a quote that says, just get rid of that small mind called self, and there's nothing in the universe that can harm or hurt you. So I think that was partially what his point was. Now, this topic, just so you know, I spent my career with these elements, death, disease, and disability. I worked in acute rehabilitation, working to help people recover from brain injuries, strokes, spinal cord injuries, a host of neurological disorders. So this was very much a part of my life. But for some reason, coming upon this topic made me think back to the beginning of Theosophy for me in the very early years at the United Lodge of Theosophers, Santa Barbara. So I was getting a ride from a fellow student, and it was curious, when I got in the car, she had a little note pinned to her steering wheel. And it said, beginnings are important, endings are inevitable, and change is constant in the universe of ceaseless transformation. And I still remember that quote. But, you know, doesn't that seem like an appropriate quote to have on your vehicle? And we're coming to the end of this series. So death seems some appropriate. But the author of that quote, Dr. Raghavan Iyer, at that same time, I was given a recording of a talk that Dr. Iyer gave in London in 1963 on death and immortality in Tibetan Buddhism. And what's relevant to us and what surprised me, oh boy, is he began the talk with this quote from the Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna tells Arjuna that true wisdom of a spiritual kind is a meditation upon birth, death, decay, sickness, and error. And that seemed odd to me at the time because I was making a separation between Hinduism and Buddhism. But of course, the Buddha was a Hindu and had been taught by the greatest teachers of his time. So in Theosophy, we are taught that the wisdom of the ages is found in Theosophy is the root from which all the philosophies and religions come. Now, this meditation is important because you think about life, it's inseparable from death. The whole experience of what we call life is inseparable from death. A life without death that's a different kind of life. That's the kind of life that Alex was talking about. It's eternal life. Physical life is a different story. Now, it is, once you're involved with life, it is ceaseless transformations. It's birth and death continuously. And once you're born, you're subject to conditions of life, which means decay, sickness, and error, right? And unless one is free from error, one will be continuously subject to rebirth. Now, what is death? we go back to the initiate, the ancient Theosophist Plato, and he simply defined death as the separation of the body from the soul, and the separate condition of the body when released from the soul, and the soul when released from the body. Now, this is from the Phaedo, and by the way, the whole Phaedo is about the death of Socrates. So I would recommend anyone that's really interested in this subject to go and take a look at that dialogue, that Platonic dialogue. So birth would be the union of the body and the soul, just the opposite. And of course, in Theosophy, we call it the permanent individuality, the reincarnating ego, the pilgrim soul, with an evanescent personality to which it's an exact fit, placed by the law of the universe, karma. And the problem is that we often mistake the personality ego for the individuality ego. And then all our problems start. Now, the Theosophical classification is a bit more complicated. This is from the Gita Theosophy. And if you look to the right, you'll see more of the spirit of what Alex was talking about. It says, guarding with prana the lower nest, the immortal moves away from the nest. That immortal one goes wherever he likes, the gold gleaming genius, the solitary bird, the Hamsa, referred to in the voice of the silence, is symbolized by AUM. So that really is the Atma, but if we're talking about individuality, is Atma in union with the Karana Upadi in the Taraka Raja Yoga system. And HVB often talks about an astral man, and that is probably the Sukshmapadi. These bodies in the Taraka Raja Yoga system can be separated from each other, and you can act independently one from the other. So the initial separation is from the Stulapadi, the physical, the Sukshmapadi, then the Sukshmapadi being absorbed in the Karanapadi. So that's the more complicated picture. The interesting thing for us, and this really fits in with Alex, from the Phaedo again, surely the soul can best reflect when it is free from all distraction, such as hearing or sight or pain or pleasure of any kind. That is when it ignores the body, and as far as possible, avoiding all physical contacts and associations as much as it can in search of reality. That's meditation, right? And meditation is purification. And that purification is the whole effort of the philosopher or the theosophist, is to separate the ever-fleeting from the everlasting, to separate the soul from the body. This being a critical element, as Alec pointed out, to the fundamental elements of health. And this is also found in the Voice of the Silence, where I just said to replace the fleeting with the false. And first step is to learn to discern the real from the false, the ever fleeting from the everlasting. And also, before thou can approach the foremost gate, thou hast to learn to part thy body from thy mind, to dissipate the shadow, and to live in the eternal. And I feel like that's what Alex was talking about, living in the eternal. For this, thou hast to live and breathe into all, as all that thou perceivest breathes in thee, to feel thyself abiding in all things in self. And Eva very much focused on this element of that to live in the eternal, the discipline and conduct is to live and breathe in all. That's the breath of health. Health is to live and breathe in all. And that is how we learn to live in the eternal. And that is the perfected being has done that. Curiously, that the perfected being, that says the alaya, or the universal soul, is both the self of the progressed adept and the universal soul. And so when we confront a perfected being, that being is the universal soul. And so are we. Now, we talk about disease. I thought that the Buddhist conception of dukkha was most relevant, because dukkha is disease. Actually, disease is just being not at ease, right? So it doesn't matter if it's mental disease, psychological disease, or physical disease. It means you're not at ease and you're not at peace. And that is like living off center, with the center that is everywhere and circumference nowhere to be found. And probably, if one is going to live a healthy life, one needs to impact these two aphorisms from HVB onto one's mind. And that is that life is built up by the sacrifice of the individual to the whole. Each cell in the living body must sacrifice itself to the perfection of the whole. When it is otherwise, disease and death enforce the lesson. So it's this lack of living in harmony with the whole and understanding that each personality is just a contribution to that whole. Harmony is the law of life, discord its shadow, which brings suffering, the teacher, the awakener of consciousness. So all disease, all disability, in the end, is a teacher. Now, I won't go much into this, but I thought Vikash did a wonderful job of talking about the practical, fundamental element of looking at that everything is alive, everything is conscious, and everything receives our impress. And then returns to us either life-giving or death-dealing. So that every physiological change, diseases, life itself, or rather the objective phenomena of life, produced by certain conditions and changes in the tissue of the body, which allow and force life to act in that body. That all of this is due to those unseen creators and destroyers. So there's this constant flow. This is a circulation in the human body. This is the brain and spinal cord. And the brain, the two hemispheres remind me very much of the two serpents of the Caduceus. That the aspiration is for that which is above and beyond the gold gleaming genius, the solitary bird of immortality. And then just to remind us that the whole body is a magnet, that we're constantly drawing these life atoms, these scintilla, these elementals to us. And that the actual secret of health is very simple, as B.P. Wadia put it, that we remember these things to create a calm mind, an enlightened heart, and a healthy body. We have to have the right exchange of these life atoms. And that has to do with the selection of food, in the taking of exercise, in regulating the hours of sleep and waking, in amending bad habits and forming good ones, in the matter of bodily cleanliness with its psyche and magnetism. A knowledge of this doctrine is very necessary. Now, when I look at this, I think, well, this is nothing new. Yeah, it isn't anything new, but do we follow it? This simplistic elements of health. So if harmony is the law of life, altruism is the rule of conduct. And harmony is actually accentuated by discord. That's the curious thing about disease. It highlights the value of being free from disease. Disharmony can be an element of harmony. So this is an instance that many people who have had a spinal cord injury, which leaves them paralyzed from the waist down, have told me that they feel like they have found a deeper and more fulfilling life. Now, I'll give one example. Christopher Reeve, many of you may know him as one of the first Superman movies. In 1995, during dressage training, he was thrown from his horse and he broke his neck. Cervical spine injury with complete paralysis from the neck down. He couldn't breathe, and he would have died if there hadn't been immediate paramedic help at the time, because he had to have a sustained on a respirator. He could not breathe on his own. And he really thought about just giving up his life. You know, you're completely paralyzed. I can tell you, this is unbelievable. Oh, God. Talk about imprisonment. How would you like to be in a body where you could not move anything? So, but his wife, said she was totally with him. She'd give him total unconditional support. And through rehabilitation, he was able to regain some function, and he was able to get off a ventilator for like 90 minutes or so. And then he became an activist for people with disability, and especially spinal cord and legislation for people with disability. Wrote a number of books on the subject. So even though he's paralyzed, he ended up a pretty fulfilling life. And he said, who knows why accidents happen? The key is what to do afterward. Now, that certainly does seem to be the key. Spirituality is found in the way, well, I should say that I say something about that accident. He says, who knows why these accidents happen? But if you think back to the teaching in Theosophy about elementals, classes of elementals, how every principle in us is associated with them and how we oppress them and they come back, you can see that there are invisible forces that we have no idea that may come to bear on a certain point of time and space that we call an accident. Now, spirituality is found in the way we live our daily lives. That's Christopher speaking. It means spending time thinking about others. It's not so hard to imagine that there is some kind of higher power. So Christopher found some meaning in the last years of his life. you're very vulnerable to a number of death-dealing problems when you're paralyzed from the neck down. Now we go back to Plato. It's interesting that he makes this comment. He says, but bodies, this is from his dialogue, The Republic, but bodies which disease had penetrated through and through. Asclepius, who is both the god of health as well as the incarnation of that god, Asclepius would not have attempted to cure by gradual processes of evacuation and infusion. He did not want to lengthen out good-for-nothing lives, or to have weak fathers begetting weaker sons. If a man was not able to live in the ordinary way, he had no business to cure him, for such a cure would have been of no use either to himself or to the state. Now, this seems pretty harsh, right? When we think of Christopher Reeve, he did manage to make a constructive life. But there is a point made by Plato that is quite relevant. And this comes up in a book by Atul Gawande, Being Mortal, Illness, Medicine, and What Matters in the End. And he notes that 1/4 of all Medicare expenses are spent on the last year of life. If you don't think money is important in healthcare, you haven't been in the hospital taking care of people. So what are the responsible choices to be made at the end of life for oneself as for those to whom we are responsible? And statistically, on average, in the last 8 years of an American's life, a person will be dependent upon health. So that's something that's a wake-up call. 8 years where we'll need people to help us in our life, physical health. So can I afford to hire help? Can I afford long-term care insurance? Do I need long-term care insurance? And what kind do I need? Can I afford a retirement facility or assisted living? Now, this is just thinking particularly of, when you get older, but this can also all be relevant to disability. And also, just warn everybody that life is, you never know what's going to happen. Whether it's an accident or a sudden onset of disease or whatever it is, life is unstable. Now, this just gives you some idea how costly some of these kinds of care are. So it shows you how important money is. And just the practicalities, I wanted to bring up that it's important to have a death plan of some sort in your mind, because as karmically responsible agent, as individuals, we owe it to those that we leave behind. And I might mention that having been by the deathbed of many a person who has died, one of the remarkable things for me is so often I just feel this tremendous benediction that they have for the rest of mankind. For all the sufferings and travails, there's this tremendous light that goes out from those who have lived a decent life, for all those that are left behind and that are struggling in the coils of existence. But part of this that would help those left behind is letting people know about what you would like to be done after your death. Who should be notified about it? What needs to be done with your body? How to access your financial and legal documents. This is to the appropriate individual. And of course, these days, how to handle your social media accounts and online assets. Plato says this much. He says, but this much it's fair to keep in mind, friends. If the soul is immortal, then it needs care not only for the sake of this time, in which we call life, but for the whole of time. So we constantly have to think of our life today, our whole life in this life as a personality, in relation to the whole of our time as an immortal soul. That gives depth and breadth to the minutiae of existence. And if anyone is going to neglect it, now the risk would seem fearful. Because if death were separation from everything, it would be a godsend for the wicked when they die. To be separated at once from the body and from their own wickedness, along with the soul. But since in fact it is evidently immortal, there would be no other refuge from the ill or salvation for it, except to become as good and wise as possible. For the soul enters Hades, taking nothing else but its education and nurture, which are indeed said to be of the greatest benefit or harm to one who has died at the very onset of his journey. So we know that at death, we have a second death, here called Hades or Kamaloka, where we're separated from all the material elements before we move on into a more blissful state of Devahan. But I think I'll leave the talk at this point to give some room for discussion and questions. And thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Robert, for bringing in the profound and the practical. Thank both speakers, Alex and Robert, for a wonderful presentation. And now